Welcome, everyone, to Nerd of the Rings. I have a very special guest with me today, one of my all-time favorite Tolkien illustrators, Mr. Ted Nasmith. Ted, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Good to be here, Matt. Cheers.
Now, Ted, I always like to start folks off with the same question every time, and that is, how were you first introduced to Tolkien's books?
Easy answer. I have an older sister, and she and her boyfriend at high school at the time, in the late 60s, were reading Lord of the Rings. They were a bit of a fan group there, and she handed me the Fellowship, the Ballantine edition, and said, I think you might like this. And so that was that. I started reading it immediately, just fell in love with the whole thing. Part of the reason was I didn't have an idea that it was a sort of a fantasy story set in the mythical past at all. I thought it was science fiction or something like that, and that was just a misunderstanding of the artwork that Barbara Remington created for the covers. Where you put them three together and it would be one poster, which I had that poster for a bunch of years too, but it was just like, yeah, what? It looked like a rocket taking off on the front cover of Fellowship, so that threw me. And it was a good thing, because when I started reading it, it was just like, oh, it's all set in this kind of English, countryside, mythical past, storybook kind of situation. So it's like, wow, okay.
So for a while, you were waiting for the spaceships to show up.
Yeah. But yeah, it turned out to be just like perfect, like, oh my God, I love this. It just, brought me back to years of when I was, very young, when I loved fairy tales and that sort of content, absolutely.
Now, I wanted to pull up this image. This is a illustration you did of an unexpected party, and there's a fun story behind this. And it's that you actually sent this to JRR Tolkien when you were 17 years old.
That's right, 17 years old. Yeah, of course. By this time, realizing that I wanted to do artwork, it was just a natural thing, very spontaneous. And I was in high school at the time, an art student, and there was the opportunity to do a project which would fulfill the assignment and create an art piece for Tolkien. So this was it. And yeah, I thought, well, I'll take some photos of that and some of the other early bits of Tolkien that I'd done by then, send them to Tolkien himself, who, amazingly enough, wrote back with a little aerogram that his secretary had typed up and signed, but conveyed his comments to me. And he did certainly look at the thing, and ultimately was very positive, really. And that for a 17-year-old who's thinking, I want to do this art. And like quite seriously want to do this art. It was a great boost for me. And he just mentioned that Bilbo looked a bit like a child and so on. It's like, oh yeah, okay, take that advice. And that was the one time I had some criticism from the man himself, and certainly it was an excellent thing to happen to me. Too bad I lost the letter, though.
Oh, that was going to be my next question, was whether you still had the letter.
Yeah, no, who knows? One day it might just turn up in the bottom of a box somewhere. But I don't expect to. But it wasn't signed by him, so it's not quite the kind of tragedy it might have been.
Right.
And we got the message delivered to me, so that's the important part.
Exactly. Yeah. Now I'm curious, going back a little bit. So from the time where you read Lord of the Rings to the time you kind of said this is something that I want to make a career out of. At what point did you decide, like, I would love to draw Tolkien, for my career?
Well, when the calendars began arriving from Ballantine, I guess it would have been, that was a galvanizing moment. There was Tim Kirk, I think 1975, and JRR Tolkien's own artwork, I think 1973 and 4. But very early on, I was seeing these calendars coming out, and I'm thinking, I could easily illustrate one of those, and with some strong ideas about authenticity in representing Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings. So I set my sights on that as a possibility, but it did take till the mid '80s to get any kind of serious response from the publishers. But I had, gone about making sure that they could see I joined the Tolkien Society partly to have some contact with the publishers through them. There would be some sort of respect, between them as organizations. And sure enough, my artwork was turned over to one of the editors there, Jane Johnson, at the time, and she did write to me and say that we have a representative going over to Ottawa, Canada, I guess it would have been about 84, 85, and who was able to meet with me in person, and that I was able to show him my originals, the ones that I'd created by then, so quite a few. And then the following year, they were included in the 1987 Tolkien calendar, which would have been, set up in the previous year.
Yeah.
So that was the breakthrough time to finally sort of reach a large audience with my art, and I didn't see any other venue that would have made any sense up until or at that point in time. They weren't going to do an illustrated Lord of the Rings, and The Hobbit was still JRR Tolkien's own artwork.
Right.
So these were the kinds of situations I was in at that point. And then another calendar the year after, and then 2 years later a full calendar. So the calendars became the main thing that I was aiming for. And when Hildebrandt's calendars came out, that particularly galvanized me, because I was just looking at them, just shaking my head, thinking, well, it's colorful, it's bright, it's interesting. They've clearly taken the book seriously, but they're so wrong at times. Just So this is I've got to show them what I think it ought to be, and just a bit more kind of serious approach to it. But well, they love their Disney art, and that was kind of their wellspring of ideas, I think.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Now, before we started recording, we talked a little bit about the Silmarillion, and so tell us about how that opportunity came about. That first time that you illustrated the Silmarillion. Of course, we did get another version of the Silmarillion last year with your illustrations, but you had done an earlier version quite a while back.
Sure, back in the 1990s. There was a point where I decided I'm going to read the Silmarillion again. It's time for me to look at this with an eye to possible illustrations. Went through the whole thing, made little, pencil marks at each point on a page where I thought there's a scene there that I could easily kind of conceive of and have, some idea of where it would go. And then I proceeded to do all these thumbnails, probably some 200 or so.
Oh, wow.
And then this is all in my own time, sort of thing. I'm working as an architectural renderer in the day job at that point, still doing that kind of work. But more and more, Tolkien is becoming a big thing for me. And I then went on to do color sketches, like little sort of studies of about 80 or so of those 200 thumbnails. And with that, I thought, well, maybe there's a possibility of an art book of some sort, artist's journey through the first age of Middle Earth, and this kind of idea. So put it all together in sort of a spiral-bound, photocopy book. Sent it off to HarperCollins and the people there that I knew that were publishing the calendars, and just thought, well, see what they say about it.
Yeah.
Their response was that we've shown the sketches to Christopher Tolkien. We have a meeting with him several times a year, and just a regular meeting, and we showed him this artwork, and he was interested in the possibility of an illustrated edition, which was something that he had turned down several times before that, apparently. So they had asked him whether that might be a way of, making the book more readable, more sort of acceptable, and so on, palatable. And so that was unexpected, that this would be the result, that he himself would consider an illustrated edition with this artwork.
Yeah.
And in the end, we didn't have a lot of time when it came down to it, sort of less than a year, to both decide on which pictures, and he was very particular about that. So working with him directly rather than through the editor, which is the normal process with illustrators. There's a middleman there at the publishing house.
Yeah.
But Christopher wanted to work with me directly, and I was comfortable with that, having worked with big clients in the past as well. So that was the agreement we made, and it went very smoothly. But it took some weeks to actually come down with the list of artworks. About 16 we could fit in where each of the bundles in the book are separated, basically. And I came up with 2 concepts for each one of those slots based on a few pages before or after. And then we just eventually narrowed down the list to the ones we were going to include. And there were certain criteria that were involved. And I did, in some cases, argue successfully for my choice over the one that Christopher thought he would like to have. And all of this ultimately, I had 8 months to do the actual illustrations, so that was a bit of a breakneck situation.
Yeah.
But I rose to the occasion, and then 4 or 5 years later, they decided to re-release the book with a few more illustrations, and they were thinking of drawing on the calendar that had accompanied it, the 1998 edition, which did have separate artworks. But it was Christopher himself who said, "What's the big rush bringing it out in 2003? Give him an extra year and he'll probably produce a lot more artwork," which I did, which is another 20 pieces. So the one that came out in 2004 had about 45 illustrations versus about 20 in the earlier edition. And I was able to turn some of the illustrations sideways so that they were horizontal versus vertical. Something I didn't even think to ask about the first time. And so that offered opportunities to redo 1 or 2 of the pictures as well. So all in all, it was, it was like a very, very successful situation for me, and raised my stock. And I continue now to do this artwork through private commissions mostly. But yeah, it's amazing to me how well it's gone, including just recently this guest appearance in Lucca, Italy. So yeah, just like phenomenal response to that. It seems my art matters to people.
Absolutely. I can definitely attest to that. I'm curious, what was it like working directly with Christopher?
He's very gracious. He's very professional. He respected me, certainly. He knew of me. And I just took it in stride. We communicated via fax machine mostly, and so I have all these lovely faxes with his handwriting because he wasn't typing it out. And we would just discuss, whichever picture it was, and whatever needed to be discussed. But it was all very kind of positive. There was never anything negative or unpleasant at all. And when it was through, when we had reached all the decision making needed to get it where it needed to be, he let me know that our correspondence was at an end. There was no need to continue, in a kind of friendly way, and that was fine. I quite acceptable, given his position. He didn't want to just be lifelong friends with everyone he comes in contact.
Right.
But I have tremendous respect for him. He treated me with great respect, and that was what produced good artwork, fortunately.
Now, you mentioned, for that first book, you and Christopher kind of working together, and kudos that you won some arguments against Christopher. I can't imagine that a ton of people can say that when it comes to Tolkien books. I'm curious now, when you do something like, whether it's the newest edition of the illustrated Silmarillion or a calendar or anything, is there much conversation on what pieces specifically, or is it now to the point where they say, "Okay, Ted, we need 10 more Silmarillion illustrations, go," and then you just do your thing?
It is more or less they give me free carte blanche, free choice on the subjects. They know that I, probably, and they are right, that I have lists of subjects that I still haven't, covered. Mm-hmm. So there's no lack of ideas from me. If they want a list of subjects ahead of time, no problem. I'll definitely do that. We can agree on which ones. Now, Unfinished Tales is a case in point where the subjects were divided between the 3 artists.
Right.
that was something that Chris at HarperCollins had never done before. So he essentially
That one.
allowed me to give my first, second, and third choices for which artworks I wanted to do, because I definitely had preferences. And the same with Alan and John. And then, as best he could, he assigned illustrations to all three of us that would at least include some of our first choices.
Yeah.
And that was how we were able to create a pretty agreeable situation that, allowed for good creative effort. No sense that, oh, this is, not the one I would have wanted to do or anything of
Yeah.
that sort. And I think it was very successful, therefore.
Absolutely. Yeah. And for those, if you're not familiar, we're referring to the Unfinished Tales that just came out last year, or the year before.
2 years now.
Couple years. Yeah. And so this one is illustrated by not only Ted, but also Alan Lee and John Howe. So you've got the whole trifecta there in this one book. I was kind of curious how that divvying up process worked out, like if there was any drawing of straws that happened or anything.
If there was, it was all Chris at HarperCollins, calling it.
Yeah.
Had a complicated list of possibilities, and all three of us wanted to do. But yeah, it seemed to come down perfectly nicely at the end
Yeah.
of the day. Yeah.
Now,
I was just glad that the one piece that I particularly felt strongly about was the Gondolin one. He beheld a vision of Gondolin amid the snow. It was a line that I had forgotten, and it isn't in the Silmarillion. It's a smaller version, it's a shorter version of the story, which talks about the green fields of Tumlad and of the valley, which doesn't make any sense because it's the middle of winter. But of course, the unfinished tale, Fall of Gondolin, you have up until Tour is standing there looking out over the city, and that's where it ends. That particular version, but it does talk about the winter, the fell winter, the pool of Ivrin frozen, seeing Turin, running northwards at the same time, which was a moment that Christopher wanted to illustrate it as well, because it is one of the only crossover moments between those two tales.
Yeah, I love that moment.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So for some reason, I just didn't, understand that whenever you do that scene, it's got to be in winter, despite what Tolkien himself describes in that one particular version of it. So, those are the odds and ends that you deal with Tolkien. He isn't always consistent with himself, and therefore that gives you some license and some ability to interpret intelligently when it comes to doing artwork versions of things. And that's part of what gives it its constant kind of interest to me as well. No, it's not straightforward at all.
Now, I'm curious, what is it about Tolkien's world that resonates most deeply with you, and kind of lights that fire in you to portray it in this creative way?
Yeah, I guess it's the fact that it despite the terrible things that happen in a realm like that, where evil is really quite evil and extraordinarily, terrifying, nightmares coming to life, as it were, it still seems to be a world which operates by rules that are reasonably coherent. I mean, I know Tolkien does get into the gray areas. People don't necessarily give him credit for this, but very much the gray areas between good and evil. And a character like Boromir or Denethor or Saruman, and they turn out to be, they give the whole thing such great gravitas, I find. And even Gandalf, when he's struggling with the temptation to take the ring or to allow this hobbit to be entrusted with it, but, the story hangs on this pivotal moment when he says, "I would take it out of pity and become a new Dark Lord of my own," kind of thing. And that's profoundly wise thinking and moral kind of like judgment on a situation, and shows that it's by far a much more complex moral story. And I just the I guess basic decency, the camaraderie, the emphasis on friendship, and just a code of honor among people, and sticking to things in spite of the odds and obstacles and so on like that. I think it just reaches into your heart so much, I find, and is a great guide to real life in many ways. So and I just you inhabit these characters over the years, such that it does feel very familiar and very natural to continue expressing those images, and there just aren't. There's no real limit to it. I do
Yeah.
feel like it's a life's calling, and then it's a life's calling for a lot of other artists who also see their own kind of visions and ideas in there. But I still get a real kick out of it. I guess and that's important, because if I was bored, I don't suppose too many other people would be very interested either. So,
Now, I'm curious, when you go to illustrate a scene out of Tolkien, do you typically go back and read the applicable passages, or do you ever just go start on it purely based on what you recall of it, or what's your process like in the beginning there?
well, that's an excellent question, because it's somewhere between those two things. If I was very disciplined, I would go in and read the passage before I'd come up with any ideas or images. But it is sometimes the case that I've already got a strong kind of mental impression, and I will go back to read what it says, so that I don't do anything that's ridiculously off the beam.
Yeah.
But I will sometimes find out, oh, I didn't, that part of it I forgot about, and sort of have to adjust back to some sort of balance with what Tolkien's describing, and what may be a pretty compelling image visually at the same time, and work out the dynamics because of that. I have a couple of people that I consult regularly when I'm in the creative process,
Mm-hmm.
working out how exactly I'm going to express such and such, and they're very these are very productive discussions, because we usually discover that there's stuff in Tolkien that is surprisingly paradoxical, or um, there's various ways one could interpret what he's saying.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So we do our best to come up with what we think is the optimum kind of interpretation, which accounts for the need for visual interest,
Yeah.
and the theatrics of picture making, as well as being true to the spirit, if not the letter, of the text itself. And that always gives us a lot of ammunition and ideas. I mean, people think Tolkien's, like Lord of the Rings, is super detailed, but it's just when you want some detail that he doesn't give it to you.
Right.
So that's fine. It leaves you room for interpretation and making your best guess, and that's, I think, great. It's not handed to you, and it shouldn't be. It should be something where you have to work towards some kind of balance of your own integrity as an artist, and what works in terms of just basic picture making, and just does seem to ring true to what we've read in the book. So those are the kinds of things that continually inform my approach to the pictures.
Now, are there any times off the top of your head that I'm curious where you ran into that, where you were thinking, gosh, it'd be nice to have a little detail here, and then you kind of had to, fill in the blank, so to speak?
I can't think of any one time when I did that.
Yeah. Or even vice versa, where you mentioned before, where you kind of start down a path and then you read something and like, oh, he inserts this detail that I missed.
Right, and I didn't come prepared for specifics either. I can tell you a case where we had to struggle with what Tolkien gives us, and come up with something that actually made plausible sense if you were to take the whole kind of picture. Again, it's like Gondolin in the snow, and not mentioning the snow and actually describing a green field when that's impossible. Well, the Fellowship come through Moria. They lose Gandalf, and they emerge into the high mountain air.
Mm-hmm.
They have been through a snowstorm on the other side, where Caradhras, forces them back, and then they go through the underground passage into Moria. And it is as if a season has changed when they come through Moria, which it couldn't have been more than a few days. Maybe he doesn't really give us a full timeline, but just think maybe 2 weeks or so under the ground like that. That's not really going to, once they're out, it's still winter. It's still December, and he's following a calendar. Yet he describes the landscape around the Mirror, which they encountered quickly as they're heading down the mountain path, as this green kind of sward around this beautiful Mirror Lake. And I'm like, oh boy. And I by this time have been to Switzerland twice with the same people that are my consultants, Alex and Ruth. And they're doing a book on Tolkien's Trek of 1911, trying to retrace his steps. So they're all over the Bernese Oberland, and including the Lauterbrunnen Valley and places like that were inspiring for Tolkien's landscapes.
Yeah.
And so I've got a pretty good idea of what it's like up on a mountain or up on a high point of land, in terms of weather and other things like that, just attend on that sort of situation. So I'm trying to do the Mirror, the Durin's Crown scene, which is a commission, and still be true to the Lord of the Rings as described, but also acknowledge that it's still winter.
Yeah.
So I just added more snow in kind of a patchy way that you see here in Canada at times. Could be middle of winter, but it still might be kind of the snow is melted and you're kind of in between storms or something like this, right? So in order to accommodate that logical problem, so these are the kinds of things that you do encounter. I mean, here's Lothlorien. He describes it as without a blemish.
Mm-hmm.
The trouble is, what makes a picture interesting are the flaws.
Yes.
In the imperfections that are in nature and that are organized in this like rather appealing way. The sort of the way the light hits it, a certain whatever. And if you have a land that is absolutely perfect and without blemish, it's probably a bit boring too, and a bit sort of too perfect for the artistic integrity that I don't know, so those are the sorts of things where you have to take a bit of license and give people what they don't even know what they think it's going to be in their mind's eye. And I never get people saying, that's not what he said.
Yeah.
Almost never that kind of situation. I mean, you used to occasionally get someone who was a real kind of purist say, he didn't say that, whatever. But it's a bit of a game. You get inside the words, and instead of doing just the words themselves and to their letter or whatever, you get behind them and understand that interpretation of the larger meaning is what you want to aim for. Yeah. I think that's one reason that my art has been well embraced for as long as it has. Certainly is not boring me anymore. I'm soon.
And that's a really interesting point. The fact that it's still winter, because I think it's only a few days actually that they're traveling in Moria, and so I never have stopped to think about it. That does lead me into another question I had for you was, do you bring real world inspiration, into your work as you're illustrating Tolkien? And you even mentioned a couple there. You said, kind of the patchy snow like you get in Canada sometimes, and you mentioned Switzerland.
And exploring winter. Switzerland's mountains and places that we think he saw, and it may have inspired some of his own ideas of Middle Earth. So one of them would be there's a lake which is pronounced, I could never pronounce the name of it, up above Kandersteg in the middle of the Oberland. And there is one of these beautiful Swiss lakes, upland lakes, teal colored water. I mean, just beautiful aqua colored water, full of minerals. And on the other side of this lake is a sheer wall rising directly out of the lake and then resolving into mountain heights beyond that. So you're thinking, if he saw that,
Mm-hmm.
that's Moria, right
Mm.
there with a lake in front of it. Only he changes it to this, flooded valley that used to be there, and then it was dammed up and so on, and then you have this magic door in the middle of it, and you can actually see a bit of a. You could walk about halfway across to where the middle of this wall was on the shore, like kind of gravel that reached around there, and
Mm-hmm.
so you got exactly the kind of situation where you could imagine a group of people trekking towards the middle of this wall. So anyway, I was able to use that very landscape, the real mountain, in a picture of the Fellowship approaching Moria, which would be about an hour before sunset, say, and so you've got a bit of light heading the whole thing, but a lot of atmosphere at the same time, and a sense of foreboding. So it's just knowledge of that idea that we could add a real landscape into one of the Lord of the Rings pictures that just excited me at that point.
There we go. So this is the one you're talking
Oh
about.
yeah, there we are. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. So we've got the Fellowship in the foreground here, and making their way around to the
Yep.
doors of Durin that are hidden at the
Yep.
moment.
Way over there, and just the last rays of the light hitting them there. But that was a lot of fun to do, and I might even do a version of it that's larger. This was only about 12 inches wide, but it was a case of our client was someone who had wanted a picture from me, an original, for a long time. Suddenly found that her funds had to go to a new car. And so we worked it out that, we're going to give you a picture. It'll be a bit more of a sketchy one, but I put the time in on that, and it was just a lot of fun to do that because I had the idea of it already anyway. So win-win.
Yeah. Now, what's the the process? You mentioned thumbnails earlier, so you use thumbnails quite a bit from the sounds of it, where you presumably make like a much smaller, less detailed version of it, and then go on to make the actual illustration from there. So what's your process from, like, okay, I'm gonna do this illustration to final illustration?
Yeah. And so let's say I have a commission from private client. He names the subject, such as Durin's crown, or the one I did where it was Fingolfin's cairn up on the mountainside, looking down into the Gondolin Valley, and ideas and sometimes subjects that I wouldn't have even thought of. So I probably already have an idea in my head just from the title that suggested. One that is coming up is the Sea of Rhûn. Just completely open, whatever way I want to treat that subject, and so we're having fun with that one right now. That's the one that's coming up next. But anyway, a thumbnail drawing will ensue quickly, maybe more than one, and if I'm thinking, okay, that's nailed it, that's pretty good, all you need is a few little dynamics to express something usually, and then move on to either color sketches or a larger linear version, full size maybe. And while you're painting it, you may develop some of the details on the side to be applied to it as it goes along. But you've got the basic composition there, and you know it's going to go into it. So, for instance, one I'm working on currently, just finishing up, it's Rivendell looking west from the other opposite end, and it's the company of Gandalf, Bilbo, and the dwarves coming up the pass, also using Lauterbrunnen in Switzerland as inspiration for that. And we're seeing far below Rivendell, the homely house, illuminated by a shaft of light, but around them there's gathering clouds and a lot of weather looking and a lot of detail in there. And there's this column of dwarves and Gandalf and Bilbo. Well, the ponies, the dwarves, all of the characters, I knew where they were going to go roughly, but I had painted the whole sort of background of it and foreground and other things before I actually sat down and drew it in detail. So it's just that I knew it would be able to be fit into that area. And sometimes you're scaling a little drawing up or down so that it's exactly the right sort of size for the picture itself, things that you don't necessarily think about ahead of time. But as long as you've got the platform, you can play around with the kind of moving parts, and that's so you're applying some creativity to the final piece of art. Whereas I did have, sketched in the small little miniature versions of the, in color. You could see the characters there, but it was just like, well, just quick, just like here's where they're roughly being positioned, and then but yeah, later on I get down to it and finish it and figure it out. Maybe it's architecture in some cases as well, just going in and more detailed drawing of that. Ilmarin at the top of Taniquetil was an interesting case of, okay, let's come up with something where it's just both Varda and Manwë have mansions up there, separate ones, and the architecture is going to have to be pretty exotic, just very otherworldly and other illuminated, light that is, kind of holy or something like that.
Yeah.
So those are kinds of wonderful challenges, how to kind of create a realistic looking image, which is dealing with a very esoteric, mystical subject. Those are the things. How an artist kind of interprets what is the liminal realm, the threshold between the imagination and reality, the ordinary world and the world of fairies and mystical things and all of that. That's what gives to me a big kick. Is the pursuit of that stuff. Yeah, here we are.
Yeah, so here's the Taniquetil.
And it was the first time I had done something just purely for myself. And that was just after COVID started, and there was time finally to, create a piece of art. Sorry, it was the year before COVID. It was springtime when work had slowed down, and I thought, okay, finally, I've had these drawings for some years now, and even full-size ones, and would love to take the JRR Tolkien version of this one and see if it could be done as a realistic picture. And so that was, the impetus there.
Now, that leads me to another question I have for you. So of all the illustrations you've done over the years, are there ones that, or one in particular that you are just, constantly have in the back of your mind, like, gosh, I really want to do this?
I guess there are a handful of, like, I would love to continue to illustrate Turin and some of the scenes in that one. Also Luthien and Baron. There are images. There's one with Luthien revealing herself to Celegorm. She pulls her cloak open, and it's just such a natural image and reveals her beauty as well. That it's one of those ones that I've got drawings for it. I have done a couple of color sketches years ago. Part of those ones that I submitted for the Silmarillion originally, but I've never gotten around to doing the final piece of art. So it's ones like that I keep, alive as a possibility. But whether I can ever, find the time, we'll see. But it's great that at least with private clients paying for originals, that there's a good chance that someone will come along with that one in mind as a subject, and if not, then I will get so rich and wealthy that I'll be able to set aside weeks at a time to do what I want to do, which is, for an illustrator, like, that's a luxury. That is a huge luxury.
Yeah.
Oh my God, I can do what I want to do.
So do you ever have private commissions that just say, like, hey, Ted, just make me something like that? Or do they usually have something in mind?
They usually do have something in mind, and the early discussions are held with Alex, and he knows his Tolkien, so he can really discuss things in detail and
Yeah.
knowledge with them. But and he will tell me, keep me apprised of the conversations. And he may actually ask me, like, which of these subjects, he's named 6 or 7 of them, would you prefer, or you'd be most
Yeah.
interested in, and I will give my views on that.
Yeah.
And we did actually do this very thing recently, where like he dropped about 7 different titles, and I'm thinking, I don't know if I could do much with most of those, but there's one. Okay, that one, I think we could do something with that one. And then that shapes the situation probably for the client
Yeah.
who wants me to do something that I'm interested in doing.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Sometimes I'll take a subject that I'm not that clear whether it's going to work or not, and it turns out to be tremendously interesting. So that has happened as well, and I
That,
like it that it can be open. Nobody really goes, anything you want to do, I'm fine with. That would be a new one, but it's
yeah.
come pretty close. It's come close to that. Yeah, and we do get some great clients. There's nobody that really wants to stage manage the whole thing.
Yeah.
We did the Doors of when Gandalf confronts the Witch King at the gates of Minas Tirith.
Yeah.
Never done that one from the inside, and I'd known about that scene. I'd seen one version of it with Joan Wyatt once upon a time. And I always thought, and they didn't do it in the film. It was a very different situation.
Right. Yeah.
So I thought, let's see what we can do, because Gandalf is static. Shadowfax is static. They're just standing there. They're just he's just like, you cannot pass kind of thing. And all the interest is really in the Witch King, who's, this horrible, threatening figure that everyone's cowering. Tolkien is very descriptive of that. There we are.
Yep.
And then, these doors, these great iron doors that were blasted by the, Grond and the
Yep. Got
power
Grond
of
in there.
the spell that was used, I guess. And so all this debris and the rest of it. And so how on earth are we going to make it seem like Gandalf is himself an opposite to that?
Yeah.
But it turned out that all I needed to do was angle it at a low angle, so that Gandalf is kind of like magisterial and larger in scale, so that he doesn't dwarf the Witch King, but he definitely looks like, it's gonna be hard to get past this guy.
Yeah.
And then we had a lot of fun with the architecture. Black and white is described by Tolkien, so I used that as a motif for the walls and all of that. And we wanted a rooster, even though it was mentioned as somewhere else, coming from somewhere else in the city, that there was a cock crowing. Yeah. But of course, it was a neat little thing to add, just because, Pippin looking around and witnessing this whole thing there, just hiding. So, and those are the things where, it's not exactly what the story says, but no one's going to complain, because it's part of the scene.
Yes.
And even
it's what you remember when you read it, you remember that's.
Just remember that about the cock crowing, and it's like its colors. It's got red, black, and white. So it actually fits in nicely.
And I must say, I've looked at this image because I love this moment from the books, and it's probably it's if not the number one, it's very close to the top of my list of the things that I wish we would have had in the movie trilogy, because I love this moment. And I've looked at this art piece a number of times, and I've never noticed this guy laying up on the wall until just now. So I had to point that out, because I like that addition up there.
Well, there was a lot going on at that point, and soldiers were dying left and right. So, terrible moment. I just wanted to give some indication of the carnage.
Carnage, yeah.
Of course, outside the walls, it's just like a scene of hell.
Yes, I love the flames and Grond there in the background. Oh yeah, it's one of my absolute favorites. Now, do you? Speaking of favorites, do you have a favorite or a few favorites from over the years, if or one that's particularly memorable to you?
Definitely a few favorites, and that one there, that would be one of them. I felt it was a very successful collaboration with the client, and I believe he's likely to come back for something else, if I recall. The kinslaying at El Calonde, that was challenge. That was one that Christopher encouraged me to do, and and so felt it was very successful. Very different from the color sketch that was originally proposed. We had architectural elements, very limited amount of light, a battle scene, which I'm not that great with, and designing these most beautiful ships that ever existed. So that was great to be able to do that and achieve a unified design with all that criteria. The famous lights, the lamps of the
Yes.
key are mentioned as well, but it's difficult with these kinds of scenes with no sun or moon, so on.
Yeah.
So, but it gives you some license at the same time. You can just, I'm surprised at how many people have favored Teleri ships drawn by swans, and I didn't think it was a terribly successful picture when I did it, but it still is tremendously important to people, that particular very exotic image from Silmarillion. And when you read earlier versions of some of the tales of Silmarillion, say Book of Lost Tales, the descriptive words and the ideas that are introduced that are kind of refined by the time you get to the version of what that was published. It's stunning. His creative imagination, the kinds of things that were just coming out left and right from his mind. It's tremendous. What a genius.
Now, earlier you mentioned that you're working on a piece of the Sea of Rhûn,
Yes.
and I'm very curious about that. And you've probably run into this before. We kind of hinted at it earlier, but Rhûn is one of those realms that we don't get much. We don't have much information at all.
No.
So what's your process like? You don't have to give away too many spoilers here, but what's your process been like trying to come up with the Sea of Rhûn?
Yeah, it's amazing what you can do with very little information. um, we see that there are some forests and some mountains near the lake on the map, so that's something that we can start to imagine something with. And there are a couple of things that are associated with the Sea of Rhûn. One of them would be the so-called kine of Iran, which is cattle.
Yeah.
I think Boromir's horn that
Yep.
he uses, was made from that. And I hadn't even picked up on this, particular detail. This is why I have my consultants helping me out at times. But yeah, they said, oh yeah, well that's one thing, you could have this particular type of cattle, and it would be like a kind of an ancient breed, with horns and so on. The kind of thing you get in the UK sometimes, where they preserve the genetic stock of some very exotic breeds of livestock. There, So anyway, I said, so that's one way you could have an identifier, showing it from a meadow, say above the lake or something like that. And I thought, well, a rotting ship on the shore would be a possibility for just giving some atmosphere, maybe some evidence of fishermen or fishing, this kind of thing. And you see these seascapes, the traditional marine paintings. So I've looked through some of that kind of thing for ideas as well. And, just whether it's a scene out at sea or a scene from the shore, and various weather conditions that are possible. And it looks like the one I'm favoring is actually right out to sea. You're in the middle of the lake. There's a storm going on. We've got a ship there, and you can see some mountains in the misty distance. And it sounds like that's one of the possibilities. So that is risen to. I guess the one I'm kind of more favoring. The one is more favoring, but we have two other versions where one is down near the shoreline with, maybe a wild sea against rocks and, a lot of surf. And another one that's taken from a bluff above the sea looking out kind of more panoramic, a bit like what's described when Tour reaches the sea
Mm.
in
Yeah.
the book. Yeah, he suddenly sees this rise, comes to this rise of this land, and then suddenly he's standing there, and it's all the ocean, great sea out in front of him there. Hmm. So I suspect it'll be. Will err on the side of something really artsy and a storm at sea, this sort of idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, looking forward to doing it. But so those decisions are to be made in the next little while. But I'm taking a bit of a break right now. Just finish this one and get it sent out, and maybe do a couple of little small projects that I've been waiting for.
Very cool. Now, one of the things we talked a little bit about before we started recording is the Silmarillion. And I was telling you how your edition and your illustrations, because I came to the uh, Middle Earth fandom through the movies. My view of Lord of the Rings as I was reading those books was very inspired by, I was picturing Ian McKellen when I read Gandalf. Whereas Silmarillion was very much formed by your illustrations. And you mentioned something that I thought was really interesting, and it's making the Silmarillion more accessible. When they came to you about doing the illustrated edition, and how those illustrations can make what is a pretty complex book, and it's a big hurdle for a lot of folks. It's much more biblical in its language, and it can. There's a lot of names, obviously.
Yep.
So yeah. So like you were saying, there's an accessibility that comes with having these illustrations to go with it.
Right. And you're looking at this book thinking it's an extraordinary achievement of imagination. Whatever else we say about it, now the actual content is just like this epic history with all these interacting kind of characters and races of beings, and the gods and so on, and just mind-boggling imagery. But it's not something that is made accessible with the use of sort of an everyman like a Bilbo or Frodo. And it's described in this high language, and it's a language that is also, to me, synoptic. It's like an introduction to what would have been a series of books of Lord of the Rings like length. Say Turin or Baron and Luthien or Fall of Gondolin, you get a glimpse in Unfinished Tales of what they would have been like, in more kind of broken down into greater detail, etc. Well, the job with the Silmarillion, therefore, is to reflect the beauty of the images, the fairiness of it, despite that it's this very tragic history, with one defeat after another in these terrible battles that he's describing, and the supremacy of Morgoth and his his sowing of evil, and all of the things that we see there. But I'm thinking, yes, even the horrors of a realm like that, handled in art in a way that is respectful of the tone of and extraordinary formality of the book, and his grasp of mythology that he's bringing to it. Well, that's going to be enough to at least make the book recognizable as what it is, an extraordinary work of fantasy. So just trying to make it more accessible, bringing as much light as I could into it, as well as authentically reflecting the episodes that just stood out, and that I was able to include there. So that was. It seems to have succeeded.
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't think that I'm alone in when I picture even moments that you've not yet illustrated. It's kind of like I have this lens now, through your work, that's how I see the Silmarillion now.
Well, and there's so many people that have come to me saying, it's now my favorite book. It's now the one I actually consider to be the great supreme book by him. And I do understand why you would feel that way. It's nothing compared to it at all.
Yeah.
And it's it's this unfinished work that Tolkien never could quite, bring himself to finally, kind of come down on one side or the other of it. And one of the books that I love about it most is called Arda Reconstructed by Doug Kane, where he pieces together through the history of Middle Earth and those books what the full text would have been. And before Christopher edited some of it, and there's a lot of characters that weren't included, for instance, and other stuff that's mysteriously absent, even though it seems like why wouldn't you want that part of it? So Christopher made judgment calls that he felt he needed to make for whatever reason. But
Yeah.
nice that we have the material of the previous versions, say, of various texts, and we can make comparisons and do a study of that kind that shows, the greater kind of picture that may have been there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now you mentioned, we've talked a bit throughout about the challenge of adaptation, and some of the both the challenges and the great things about sitting down to try to adapt Tolkien's work. And you've obviously done this for quite a long time, and in that time we've seen other adaptations, a lot of visual, that's what immediately comes to mind is films, TV shows, and that sort. And
Right.
we've also obviously had things like Brian Sibley's radio drama was out there as well, which is one of my absolute favorites. I always have to say that when I mention it, I absolutely love it. So when you see, whether it's Peter Jackson's films or the Bakshi film or Rings of Power, what is it easier for you to sympathize with the challenge, or do you have, is it hard for you to, see someone else's interpretation if it doesn't jive with yours?
I as an illustrator, you understand that it's an interpretive exercise, no matter who you are. And this is something that translators are faced with as well when it comes to books like that are creative, essentially, imaginative works. Well, the translation has to convey that as authentically as possible, but sometimes it's very, very difficult to do that.
Yeah.
I think the artists also are faced with, what they bring to it, what their sensibilities are, what they sort of imagine in their mind's eye, and how they like to express themselves visually in their artwork as well. So there's different criteria. Yeah, I just think the possibilities just seem to be endless in terms of stylistic variations. And I look at other work and I just sort of decide, well, I do or I don't agree with something, but I feel like I'm holding my own so that it's easier to look at other interpretations, including film and other, which are, way beyond what we would have imagined in the 70s or the 80s. Filmmaking has come a long way, and animation and other things. So I'm excited to see how that stuff is being manifested now. But I like the Bakshi movie. I thought it's pretty good considering the challenge involved and the technical kind of challenge of rotoscope and other things that he was using there.
Yeah.
Making some pioneering kinds of things, but there are other times you just think, oh, the characterization's all wrong here. Or I think we had a Boromir with a horned helmet. It was like, no, please.
I thought for the longest time, I thought that Boromir was Gimli for the longest time.
Yes.
It took me a while. I do have a certain nostalgia for the rotoscoping though, because that is that's a very particular time frame when rotoscoping was a thing that people did, and it happened to coincide with my childhood. So
right. So you adopted it nicely. Yeah. Well, I was in my 20s, I guess, at the time too. But wow.
now,
it's it's all over the map, and it's nice to see that your art, like in my case, seems to have had some influence on these adaptations as well. That's a pretty big compliment, even if it's not even mentioned. But
yeah. And then of course, obviously we had we mentioned Bathsheba. We've had the Peter Jackson movies, here over the last couple decades, I guess now. Wow,
Yeah,
that
yeah,
went
that's a
fast.
mind bender there, boy, oh boy.
Yeah. So what did you think about the Peter Jackson films, and then what did you think about the newest one, the Rings of Power?
Right. When I first watched the Jackson films, I mean, I agreed with a lot of people that The Fellowship was the most authentic, that he was most anxious to, I think, please fans and not run afoul of anybody. So he stuck fairly closely to the books. Um, and, of course, you're seeing this visually, splendid cinema experience for the first time, full color, special effects, all of that. And you'd heard so much about it over the last 2, 3, 4 years as well. So a lot of expectations there, and it was nice to be one of the people that sat down in a theater without any preconceptions because I hadn't worked on the film.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed it. I was not happy with Two Towers or Return of the King in certain respects, and those things I still have reservations about. But I have come to overall respect, I think, the achievement Jackson has with all he put into the films. The fact that they were even made at all is extraordinary. The fact that he brought as much integrity to it as he did, I think we can all be grateful for that. And they certainly were awarded richly by the industry. So by any stretch of the imagination, it was a successful adaptation, which at the same time was massively successful. Therefore, it tended to dominate the imaginations of younger artists, and or that part of it where it's different when you read something and what it forms in your imagination versus seeing it in a cinema version.
Right.
But I've come down to think, it's a very creditable version. I'd prefer the theatrical releases to the director's cuts and extended, just because I think you don't need much more in there. It's pretty rich, unless you're going to do the endings where the Shire and Reckoning and all of that,
Right.
which isn't happening, of course, and nor the Tom Bombadil episodes.
Yeah.
Part of it that I particularly enjoyed, but you can't.
Tom always gets cut out. Yeah, poor guy.
I know, even with the BBC thing, which they kind of added in that later. They actually did a special episode where it was a Tom Bombadil sort of part of the story. And there's an interesting thing about that. My friends Alex and Ruth have also written scholarly books on Tolkien, and several of them. And one of the things they did was point out that the chapters that start was it Beyond the Old Forest, or no, the Old Forest.
The Old Forest, yep.
The Valley of the Withy Window, House of Tom Bombadil, and Fog on the Barrow Downs. Those 4 chapters are almost verbatim first drafts.
Yeah.
And the rest of the book, Tolkien heavily revised and rethought, etc. But there was something very much about the dreamlike quality of those 4 chapters that he left in there. He was not necessary to the plot or anything.
Yeah.
But in a way it was too, because it just sets this beautiful tone of sort of enchantment and danger and all of that. And this character who somehow is above all of it. So that's people have been intrigued ever since. Who was he? What?
Yeah.
How did he kind of fit into it? Tolkien didn't know either.
Well, I think I've heard before that it's around that time of the book where he decides to tie it all in with the Silmarillion, and that from that point on, there's kind of like a tonal shift, and you can kind of see that moment where he decides, like, okay, this is what came after the Silmarillion.
And it's going to get darker and all of that stuff. Have a lot more weight to it than the original Hobbit would have done. There was originally a scene with Farmer Maggot where Frodo plays with the ring and kind of disappears just to be kind of coy, and that was all just Tolkien writing a sequel to the Hobbit. Whimsical scenes and a silly comedy, and that disappears quickly once he realizes it's not Gandalf coming down the path. It's this dark rider guy. Who had somehow figured out that was going to be take this thing to another level altogether. So yeah, that stuff. And as to Rings of Power, I mean, I'm happy that there's a production team doing Middle Earth in a serious, highly funded way like that,
Yeah.
and that, you know, as far as I can see, you know, they definitely take the books and the material very seriously. What they're trying to do with it is evidently kind of a prequel to the Lord of the Rings. More and more, you know, you would see indications that say, well, this is what points towards Lord of the Rings. Like this guy may be a Gandalf, maybe he isn't. And the idea of how Mordor became Mordor when it was just the Southlands before
Yeah.
that, sort of ideas that you're thinking, you know, it's interesting that someone's taken the trouble to actually portray that or project the idea of how that would be. And so I'm letting them have, you know, I'm willing to be patient and give them the benefit of the doubt to
Yeah.
that they're weaving a very interesting story, and how Morfydd Clark is portraying Galadriel, I think, is fantastic. This woman is an extraordinary actress, and you know, I don't have any problem with the diversity, other things that people have been getting up in arms about. I just think, you know, wake up. It's, you know, we're in the 21st century, and that is how it's defendable from Tolkien's point of view, and that's good enough for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I want to be respectful of your time. We're running low on time, but I wanted to get to some rapid fire questions that I like to end interviews with. What is your favorite Tolkien book?
It's got to be Silmarillion.
Yeah,
Yes, yeah.
that was going to be my guess. Yeah,
Even though I've done so many pictures for the Lord of the Rings, and I still will do, but Silmarillion seems to have, because it's got less description, there's more for the artist to bring to it. There's an argument in The Hobbit for the same rationale, actually.
Yeah.
So there we are. And
Okay.
so next one.
Favorite Tolkien character?
Oh, I think Turin, I'd say, or Luthien, either one. Both have fascinated me for a long time.
That's great. Yeah. So one of my often my answer is Children of Húrin is my favorite book because it's a that tale is just so it's depressing as all get out, but but it is interesting.
But it's very interesting.
Yeah.
And based as it is on some of the Finnish legends, I believe, as well. They were informing a lot of the story there.
What race of being in Middle Earth would you be?
Ooh, a hobbit, I suppose.
Okay.
that's kind of how I live, and you know, adopted that sort of conviviality, good, basic values. You know, just
yeah.
I suppose.
Now that might inform the next one, or it might not actually. So, where in Middle Earth would you most like to live?
I guess the Shire.
The Shire. What about visit? Is there a place in Middle Earth that you'd want to go and see one time?
Well, Numenor would be an amazing place to be. You know, I mean, because we haven't really seen it fleshed out, and that was another thing about Rings of Power, was just like getting to see some of these locations. When else would that have happened in our lifetime? So just to open up that vault of ideas and images, you know, okay, let's see where that goes. You know.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Ted, for taking the time and for chatting with me today. I will say the last thing that I will mention is I have this gap on my shelf over here because I have art books from Alan Lee and John Howe, and my shelf would look a lot better if there was a Ted Nasmith art book. So is there any chance that could be in the future?
Yeah, there is a chance of that. We're actually working on that. I'm with a fellow that does graphics, and he's a colleague, and he has the ear of also of HarperCollins. So he's in a good position to stick handle this. And I have written several chapters now. I have purchased a scanner for artworks that are old and still I don't have anything better than maybe the odd slide or the original itself. So I am working on this, and we gave ourselves a couple of years, and I guess I started on it in 2020, so we're probably running a bit behind. But yes, there is a book coming, I hope. It'll be either published through regular channels, which would be I guess, the optimum. and if not, then Patreon and some kind of funding kind of regime.
Fantastic.
Yep.
Well, I'm sure that will be that is music to my ears for sure, and I'm sure a lot of people watching this, that will be music to their ears as well.
I get that question a lot, so
I bet.
I know that we can sell that book. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I will certainly be shouting the word from the mountaintops when it does come out, because that will go straight to the top of my book list for sure.
Thank you, Matt.
Well, Ted, thank you so much again for taking the time, and I keep up the amazing work. Like I said before, your artwork is the visual lens that I see, especially the Silmarillion, but so much of Middle Earth, even in Lord of the Rings, Unfinished Tales, all of it. Absolutely love your work, and look forward to the Sea of Rhûn and anything else that you have in the making right now.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
All right. Well, we'll see you guys next time. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on Nerd of the Rings.